The early days of the internet promised us with direct access to a world of information that bypassed traditional channels such as television and radio and bypassed our geographical limitations so we could get information directly. But in recent years, it's felt like that promise has eroded. Some of us noticed Google search results were different between individuals, and this trend continued into other online media. So clearly we weren't all being presented with the same picture of the world. And we learned this was driven by personalization algorithms that filter and sort the contents we see based on predictions of what we might want to see. The original goal was to present relevant information, such as with Google search, but they've also been used to increase user engagement because if there's more user engagement, there's more exposure to targeted ads and the product is more profitable. Some have argued that this pulled us into a gravitational black hole of information, and it's been given terms such as filter bubbles and echo chambers to describe it. Eli Pariser used the term filter bubbles and hypothesized that these algorithms show us attitudes consistent with what we already believe and keep us from seeing opinions that go against our beliefs, and he argued that this eroded public discourse. My research asks if these algorithms have contributed to the recent rise in political polarization. Political polarization is a divergence of ideology between citizens of different partisan identities to the point that each becomes entrenched in their positions, and it produces an us versus them mentality that overrides any desire for a compromise. As you can see from this chart, it's been on a sharp increase since 2004. It's important to point out that these algorithms were created with some good intentions, and they continue to be useful. They were created as a reaction to the impending problem of our information era, where the amount of information that humans had to sort through was increasing dramatically and soon would become unmanageable. In the mid-1990s, Dr. Negroponte imagined a future where artificially intelligent agents could consume vast amounts of information and construct personalized summaries for us. But the idea had detractors from the beginning. Jaron Lanier was quite prophetic. He pointed out that this could be exploited by advertisers and that it would present us with a distorted cartoon version of the world that wasn't really even representative of what we wanted to see or needed to see, because he argued that that couldn't really be predicted accurately. There are a number of algorithms we could be talking about, so I'd like to make it clear which one we're referring to. As I said, they filter and sort content. They're found on Google Search, social networks, news feeds, YouTube, etc. And they do their action without your input, well, without your knowing input. So you don't have any customization options. It just does it for you. And the decisions they make are based on predictive models, which are built from psychographs, which are based on data about you, all of your online habits, your clicks, your likes, along with your demographic information, such as age and location. And it's involved with you in a feedback loop, as you can see from this graphic. So you have control over it to some degree. It's indirect, but you're not entirely at its mercy. Whether it's actually interpreting our actions correctly or not is another story. But with a little trial and error, you can start to figure out how to sort of train them to work better for you. As I said, the goal of them is to persist your attention. So ultimately, whatever keeps you there, they're going to keep giving it to you. They're going to keep giving you the content that kept you there in the first place. And the other aspect of them that I would say is problematic is that they're non-transparent. They don't tell you they're doing this. So a lot of users think the world as they see it on the internet is the world as it is, but they don't realize it's being generated for them. And in addition to not telling users this is happening, companies aren't transparent about what the algorithms are doing specifically because of proprietary information. So just to outline my goals for this research, I evaluated all the evidence for or against a correlation between the algorithms and political polarization, asking if the premise of filter bubbles is correct, do they block opposing viewpoints? And if so, does this filter bubble setting cause political polarization? And then finally, I proposed solutions based on these findings. The evidence for correlation is very strong, at least for social networks. For example, Chitro and Musco conducted a study on Twitter showing, and you can see from this graph on the bottom that the dots on the left are faintly red and blue, showing slightly opposing viewpoints on political topics. And in the middle and right graphs, they simulated personalization algorithms to increase user engagement. And as they did this, the users became much more polarized, as you can see by the increasing contrast between the colors. But the evidence wasn't as strong for news portals, such as Google News. But interestingly, sharing news content, that same content as Google News, but sharing it on Facebook showed strong evidence for political polarization. So what explains the difference between news portals and social networks? So looking into the direct causes of political polarization can help you understand this. One cause of polarization is selective exposure. which is a human's tendency to avoid opposing viewpoints. Basically, it's like a human-driven filter bubble, and this is known to lead to political polarization. On a related concept, confirmation bias also leads to political polarization, and repeated exposure to viewpoints that you agree with is sufficient to increase attitude polarization. So whenever these algorithms impose this, they're potentially creating political polarization. Also, environments where individuals feel threatened or they place limits on their ability to acquire information, these environments produce stronger selective exposure behaviors. So I would argue that we see polarization more on social networks because of the social element. People may have stronger selective exposure behaviors in social settings because they're trying to avoid conflict. And actually, the social networks, the algorithms they run, do attempt to reduce the visibility, or they do reduce the visibility of content between users of opposing views in an attempt to reduce the potential for conflict between users. So there's kind of a chicken or the egg issue here. It's a feedback loop. So if people are exhibiting these tendencies already, then the algorithms would basically amplify it because it's finding that's working in terms of keeping the people engaged. While there's agreement that there's a problem, there's less of an agreement on what to do about it. And the types of solutions that are proposed seem to stem from two basic ways of viewing the problem. There's those that view the problem solely by blaming the algorithm and point to solutions that undermine the impact of it, by hijacking its effectiveness with incognito windows, deleting cookies, browsing history, even liking posts you don't like just randomly just to confuse it. And other solutions like are legal, such as antitrust regulations, consumer data protections. The other position is to blame human nature and say there's nothing wrong with the algorithm. For them, it's a human problem, so they point to teaching media literacy. And actually, both viewpoints point to teaching media literacy, but some say it should be updated for this new world of technology, teaching people how to interpret how the algorithm is generating information or sorting it for them, and how their behaviors matter, but also interrogating the intentions of the designers, who they would say their intentions might be less than helpful. In my view, this is a feedback loop, so both ways of framing the problem have valid points because it takes two to tango, basically. Both the users and the algorithm are implicated in this problem. The solution for me is to shift the goal on both sides of the feedback loop to making sense of diverse information rather than simply consuming preferred content. So on the human side, if you're doing research for something, you're looking for the truth and not necessarily for what you want to see. If people take on this mindset, I would argue it would basically train the algorithms to give them a more representative view of the world. If you Google, for example, a question, you're more likely to get the answer than if you Google the answer to the question right in the question. So if you frame it like you already have an opinion, it'll show you content that agrees with that. So there's habits involved here that matter. And obviously, there are other times you spend online where you're not doing research or you're just online for enjoyment. So I actually have two Google accounts, one for research. And so like if I'm on YouTube, for example, doing research, I'm not going to see like recommendations. I'll see recommendations for computer science rather than the music I like. It just helps to kind of train the algorithm better. But also I think that debate, so if people learn to engage in discussions and disagree with each other in a civil manner, and if we learn to do this, then we won't be avoiding it as much. And so the drives for selective exposure would be reduced. And this is beneficial because selective exposure occurs under circumstances. If you're more confident about your opinion, you're less likely to exhibit selective exposure behaviors. And if you have to defend your opinion, you'll seek out viewpoints prior to debate, even if they're contrary to your own. So just the act of debating in a civil manner means people exhibit behaviors that are the opposite of the types of behaviors that are associated with political polarization. And when a person's engaged on a topic without a perceived threat, when it's just a rational discussion or a rational seeking of information, they'll look for information even if it doesn't agree with them. So ultimately, I don't think the tech companies should take the blame entirely because the algorithms are useful. They do give us information we need if we aren't exhibiting behaviors that signal to them that we want to avoid opposing viewpoints. But I do think that users should be given an option of unfiltered content from searches on all sorts of content, from news feeds to search, if nothing else, just to educate the users on how their behaviors are affecting things, and just to see what it's like outside of the bubble, to have access to that information. Because I think people shouldn't be blocked for that information. It should be available to all.